The combines had already gone silent. It was the third week of September 1983, and in Saline County, Missouri, the air smelled like diesel exhaust and burnt pride. Across the rolling bottomland along the Grand River, every farmer within 12 miles had quit. Their machines were stuck. Their fields were flooded at the roots but cracked at the surface, that strange, cruel paradox of a drought that had come after the rains, and the soil had turned into something the old-timers called concrete mud. You couldn't get a $90,000 John Deere 4440 through it without sinking to the axle. 3 men had tried that week. 3 men had been pulled out by neighbors, red-faced and cursing. But on the far edge of Lot 7, on a flat quarter section that everyone in town said was finished, done, worthless, best sell it now, a 61-year-old man in a faded canvas jacket was climbing onto something that hadn't moved under its own power in 11 years. And nobody was laughing yet. But they had been. Let me tell you about Saline County, Missouri, in the autumn of 1983. If you've never driven through the Missouri River Valley in September, that particular September, you need to understand what the light looks like. It comes in low and amber, almost apologetic, like the sun itself knows it hasn't been generous this year. The fields stretch out flat and wide, cut only by windbreaks of cottonwood and hedge apple, their leaves just beginning to turn at the edges. The Grand River, sluggish and brown, winds through the bottomland like it's not in any hurry to go anywhere. It rarely is. Marshall, Missouri, the county seat, had about 12,000 people in those days. It had a grain elevator on East Arrow Street that you could smell from 3 blocks away on a hot day. That thick, warm smell of stored corn and cracked soybean hull that meant money, or the memory of money. It had a John Deere dealership on Highway 65, all glass and green paint and gleaming implements on a gravel lot. And it had, like most small Missouri towns in 1983, a quiet but gathering dread. The farm crisis hadn't arrived all at once. It came the way a river floods, slowly, then all at once. Interest rates had spiked above 20% in 1980 and 1981. Land that farmers had mortgaged at inflated 1970s prices was now worth a fraction of what they owed. The USDA had just reported that farm debt nationwide had reached $215 billion. In Saline County alone, 11 farm families had received foreclosure notices between January and August of that year. The fields smelled like iron that autumn, like rust, like things that had seen better decades. And into that landscape, into that particular crisis, on that particular Tuesday, walks our man. His name was Eldon Marsh. Eldon Ray Marsh, born February 14, 1922, in a farmhouse that no longer exists on what is now County Road 463. He was the son of Harold Marsh, who farmed 160 acres with a team of Percherons until 1941, and the grandson of a man who had broken the same ground with a walking plow in 1897. Eldon had inherited 240 acres from his father in 1959, and he had added another 80 acres of river bottom ground in 1968. The kind of land everyone said was marginal, the kind that flooded in wet years and cracked in dry ones, but which Eldon, for reasons nobody fully understood, loved with a stubbornness that his neighbors found either admirable or baffling depending on the year. He was not a tall man, 5'9" in his boots, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from walnut root, thick-knuckled, permanently stained at the creases with 40 years of grease and field dirt that no amount of lava soap ever fully removed. He wore the same canvas Carhartt jacket from October through April, the left sleeve carrying a long smear of white lithium grease that had been there so long it had become part of the fabric. His cap said Pioneer Seed across the front, and he'd worn it so long the brim had curved into a tight U, like it was trying to shield his eyes from everything the world might throw at him. Eldon had served in the Pacific with the Navy from 1943 to 1946, came home, married Ruth Ellen Hodges in April of 1947, and never left Saline County again except once in 1971 when his son Dale was playing in a junior livestock show down in Springfield. He didn't need to go anywhere else. Everything that mattered was in that soil. He was also, in September of 1983, 47 days away from losing all of it. The note at First Savings Bank of Marshall was $187,000. The interest alone was running $3,100 a month. His corn crop from Lot 4 and Lot 6 had been partially destroyed by the August dry spell that followed a wet June, the worst possible combination for the silking stage of corn. His soybeans in Lot 7, his best ground, his grandmother's ground, were still standing but unharvested, because every piece of equipment heavy enough to run a header through them would sink in that peculiar, crusted, unstable soil. And the bank had already sent Gerald Prout out to look at the property. Which brings us to Gerald Prout. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever met a man whose confidence seemed to grow in direct proportion to someone else's misfortune? The kind of man who shows up when you're down not to help, but to calculate, to assess, to appraise. Gerald Prout was 44 years old in 1983, and he had the smooth, well-rested face of a man who had never once been kept awake by the weather forecast. He drove a 1982 Buick LeSabre the color of old cream. He wore a bolo tie, always a bolo tie, with a turquoise slide that he'd bought at a gift shop in Branson. He was the loan officer at First Savings Bank of Marshall, and he had, in the preceding 18 months, processed 17 farm foreclosures in Saline County. He processed them efficiently. He processed them without visible discomfort. He had also, it was known around town, been buying up foreclosed farmland through a holding company he'd registered in Jefferson City. He held an interest in roughly 480 acres of Saline County ground by the fall of 1983, land that had been purchased legally, paperwork all clean, at a fraction of its former value, from families like Eldon's. Gerald Prout was not a villain in the mustache-twirling sense. He would tell you he was simply a realist, a businessman. He would tell you, and he did tell people at the Marshall Rotary Club over catfish and coleslaw, that sentiment was not a retirement strategy, that farming was a business, that the sentimental attachment some of these older operators had to their land was, frankly, economically irrational. He said those words, economically irrational. He drove out to Eldon's property on a Wednesday morning in the second week of September. He parked his cream LeSabre at the edge of Lot 7, got out in his tan slacks and his bolo tie, and stood at the field edge looking out at Eldon's standing soybeans. A good stand, actually, 60 bushels to the acre if they could get them out, and he shook his head slowly. Not with sympathy, with the private satisfaction of a man whose math was working out exactly as projected. A few days later, at Hartley's Feed and Supply on East Vest Street, where farmers gathered on Tuesday and Thursday mornings for coffee from a percolator that had been running since 1971, Gerald Prout happened to be picking up an order. And he said, loudly enough to be heard by 6 men sitting on the nail kegs along the back wall, that Eldon Marsh's bottom ground beans were lost, that nobody was getting a combine through that field. That it was, quote, a shame, but these things happen when a man overextends. Eldon wasn't there that morning. But Dale Marsh was, Eldon's son, 27 years old, working the counter part-time while also helping his father, and Dale heard every word. 2 days later, on a Friday afternoon, the confrontation happened. It didn't happen the way confrontations do in the movies, with everyone assembled and the music building. It happened the way things happen in small towns, organically, in a parking lot, because Saline County in 1983 was small enough that everyone's life overlapped with everyone else's whether they wanted it to or not. Eldon had driven into Marshall to pick up 2 hydraulic fittings from the implement dealer and a prescription for Ruth from Rixall Drug on South Lafayette. He was crossing the parking lot of the co-op elevator on West Van Buren Street when Gerald Prout's cream LeSabre pulled in. Gerald got out, saw Eldon, and this is the part that those who witnessed it still talk about, smiled. Not a warm smile, the smile of a man holding 4 aces and watching you draw to a flush. There were, by various accounts, somewhere between 8 and 12 people in that parking lot. Farmers, a feed salesman from Sedalia, 2 women who'd come to pick up bagged fertilizer for their garden. It was the kind of audience that small-town moments accrue without anyone planning for them. Gerald walked over, he said, and multiple people present confirmed the substance of this, that he hoped Eldon was making some practical plans about the Lot 7 ground. That the bank was going to need to see some harvest receipts by the 31st of October, or they were going to have a more serious conversation about the note. Eldon said quietly that the beans were going to get harvested. And Gerald Prout looked out toward the south. You could see the general direction of the bottom ground from the co-op lot, just the line of cottonwoods marking the river, and he said something that, depending on who's telling the story, was either said with pity or with relish. He said, Eldon, there's not a machine in this county that'll get through that field. You know that, I know that, everybody standing here knows that. A pause, then, best thing might be to come in Monday, sit down and talk about your options. Your options, 2 words that in the farm crisis vocabulary of 1983 meant one thing and one thing only. Eldon Marsh looked at Gerald Prout for what witnesses described as a very long time, Then he said, softly, "I'll have a harvest ticket by the 25th. Gerald's smile didn't waver. "Eldon," he said with something approaching kindness, "there's not a combine built that'll move through that ground right now. I'd hate to see you get a piece of equipment stuck out there on top of everything else." "I'm not going to use a combine," Eldon said. And he walked to his truck. The people in that parking lot exchanged looks. A few of them, to be honest, thought Eldon had simply lost his grip, that the pressure had gotten to him, because what else could he mean? What do you harvest soybeans with if not a combine? Gerald Prout drove away. He had a lunch reservation at the Marshall Country Club at noon. Dale Marsh, who had driven his father into town that day and waited by the truck, saw his father walk across that parking lot and later said that Eldon's face was perfectly calm. Not angry, not humiliated. Calm in the particular way of a man who knows something nobody has thought to ask him. "What are you going to do, Dad?" Dale asked. Eldon opened the truck door and set his hydraulic fittings on the seat. "What your grandfather would have done," he said. "Let me tell you about Earl Marsh." Earl Marsh, Eldon's father, had farmed this same Saline County ground during the Great Depression, the 1930s, which meant he'd farmed it without the benefit of the equipment that had come later, through war and prosperity and the great post-war mechanization of American agriculture. He'd farmed it with horses and ingenuity and the kind of deep soil knowledge that comes from walking behind a team every single day for 20 years. And Earl, like many farmers of his generation, had owned a piece of equipment that by 1983 had been sitting in the back of Eldon's machine shed for 11 years. A 1948 Allis-Chalmers all-crop harvester, Model 60, serial number that Eldon had written in pencil on the shed wall in 1972, AC 60487734. Let me describe this machine because it matters. The Allis-Chalmers all-crop 60 was introduced in 1935. It was designed as a pull-type harvester, meaning a tractor pulled it rather than it being self-propelled, and it was brilliant in its simplicity. It weighed roughly 2,800 pounds compared to the 18,000 to 20,000 pounds of a modern combine, 2,800 pounds. You could almost lift one end of it with 3 strong men. It was designed to harvest grain, sorghum, soybeans, wheat, oats, clover, almost any small grain or pod crop, through a system of gentle thrashing that, when properly adjusted, cracked very few beans and left very little in the field. But the key, the crucial, everything-changing key, was its ground pressure. A modern John Deere 4440 with a grain header exerts approximately 12 to 14 pounds per square inch of ground pressure on soft soil. That's enough to sink through the crust of Lot 7's compromised clay subsoil in that September of 1983. Eldon's neighbors had proved it. 3 combines lost that week alone, 2 of them needing wrecker cables to extract. The Allis-Chalmers all-crop 60, pulled by Eldon's 1952 Farmall M, a tractor that weighed 5,400 pounds and ran on gasoline, exerted at its working width approximately 4 pounds per square inch, less than a human walking. Eldon had been doing the math in his head since June. He hadn't said a word about it. Not to Dale, not to Ruth, not to his neighbor Vernon Ackley, who'd offered to let Eldon try his field conditions first before attempting Lot 7. Eldon had just looked at the weather records, looked at his soil maps, hand-drawn maps his father had made in the 1940s, noting the clay hardpan depth in different sections of the field, and looked at that old harvester under its tarp at the back of the shed. But there was a problem. The all-crop 60 hadn't run since 1972, when Eldon had retired it as too slow for the acreage he was farming by then. 11 years of sitting. The canvas elevator belts had rotted, 2 of the concave bars were cracked, the real drive chain had frozen solid with rust, the header platform where the crop feeds in had been home to a family of raccoons for at least 3 seasons, and the sieve screens were partially blocked with old nesting material. Which is why, for 3 weeks in August, while everyone else was watching the sky and praying for rain and arguing about commodity prices, Eldon Marsh had been doing something else entirely. He had been quietly in that shed rebuilding. He ordered canvas belting from an Allis-Chalmers parts supplier in Kansas City. Cost him $47.80 for 20 feet, shipped in a cardboard tube. He machined 2 new concave bars himself on the metal lathe his father had bought in 1944, working from the original dimensions in a dog-eared Allis-Chalmers service manual, copyright 1949, that he'd kept in a wooden box under his workbench. He heated the reel drive chain with a propane torch, link by link, working penetrating oil into each joint until it moved again. He picked the sieve screens clean with a stiff brush and bent the louvered fins back to specification with a pair of pliers, and a patience that only a man who has fixed things his whole life understands. Dale helped him for the last week. He didn't fully understand what they were doing until his father explained the ground pressure math. Dale was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, "Why didn't you tell anybody?" Eldon looked at him. "Because," he said, "when something's worth doing, you do it first and explain it after." The morning of September 23, 1983, arrived in Saline County with a heavy ground fog. It came up from the Grand River the way it always did in late September, slow and white and thick, settling in the low ground, leaving the field edges wrapped in something that muffled sound and turned the cottonwoods into shadows. The temperature at 6 a.m. was 51 degrees. The sky above the fog was clear and pale, the kind of sky that promises warmth later but keeps you waiting for it. Eldon ate breakfast at 5:30, 2 eggs, white toast, coffee black from a percolator that Ruth had kept running since 1959. He read the Saline County Farmer for 10 minutes, which he did every morning regardless of what was happening in his life. Then he put on his canvas jacket, his pioneer cap, and his leather work gloves with the knuckles worn thin. He walked to the machine shed. The Farmall M was parked facing out, as he always kept it, a habit from his father's time when you never knew when you'd need to leave in a hurry. Behind it, hitched up and waiting, the Alley's Chalmers All-Crop 60 sat in the early dark of the shed with its new canvas belts and its clean sieves and its rebuilt concaves, and Eldon stood in front of it for just a moment and put his hand on the side of the real housing. The metal was cold. It was always cold until it ran. "All right," he said, to the machine or to himself or to his father, probably all three. He hand-cranked the governor on the PTO shaft, ran through the belt tensions one last time, checked the elevator drive, and then climbed onto the Farmall and turned the key. The M started on the third crank. It always did. These old Farmalls, a 1952 M on magneto ignition with a fresh valve job that Eldon had done himself in March, were among the most reliable gasoline engines ever put into agricultural service. The exhaust stack barked twice and then settled into that distinctive, slightly loping idle that Farmall M owners recognize the way you'd recognize the voice of an old friend. He drove out of the shed in the fog. Now here is where it becomes important to understand who was watching. Vernon Ackley, Eldon's neighbor to the north, had seen the shed light on at 5 a.m. and, knowing roughly what was happening, had driven his pickup to the field edge. He had his son Mike with him, who was 19. Vernon had been one of the men in the co-op parking lot when Prout made his remarks, and he hadn't forgotten it. Word in a small community travels on its own current. By 7 a.m. there were 4 trucks parked on County Road 463 at the edge of Lot 7. By 7:30 there were 7. Dale Marsh arrived with his pickup and parked next to Vernon's. Eldon's wife Ruth came out in her housecoat and then went back inside to change properly and came back out in her church coat. She stood by the fence post with her arms folded and watched. The fog was still thick when Eldon drove the M and the all-crop to the south end of Lot 7, turned around, and lined up on the first row. Let me describe what Lot 7 looked like. Soybeans stood roughly 34 inches tall, which for a maturity group IV variety planted in early May in Saline County was about right. The pods had dried and browned nicely. The beans were probably rattling in the pods, which meant they were close to 14% moisture, ideal for harvest. The stand was good, rows 18 inches apart, planted with a 4-row Deere planter, dense and even. From the road it looked like a textbook field. The only thing wrong with it was what was underneath it. The surface of the soil, if you crouched down and looked at it carefully, had this appearance. A thin, dried crust, maybe 3/4 of an inch thick, of clay soil that the August sun had baked hard. But underneath that crust from the June rains that had never fully drained through the tight subsoil, the ground was soft, not muddy. Soft, unstable. The kind of soft where if you pushed a fence post into it, you could push it 6 inches with your hand. The kind of soft that held no weight under a heavy machine. The Farmall M moved into the beans at about 2 miles per hour. Eldon had set the header height low, close cut, the way you needed it for soybeans to get the lowest pods, the pods down near the soil level where you couldn't afford to miss them. The reel turned over the crop, feeding it back into the platform. The platform crossauger gathered it to center. The feeder house lifted it up and into the thrashing cylinder. And then the all-crop 60 began to do what it was designed to do. The sound was different from a modern combine. Not the deep, constant roar of a big 40-440 or a Case IH 1480. The all-crop made a lighter sound, a chattering, rhythmic percussion, the cylinder thrashing the beans out of their pods, the straw walkers carrying the material rearward, the shoe sieve winnowing the clean beans from the chaff. It sounded to the people at the fence line like something from another time, because it was. And the wheels of the Farmall M, those tall, narrow rear wheels with their turf lugs, barely pressed into the surface crust. Eldon completed the first pass, down the south end of the field and back. The grain tank on the all-crop, it held roughly 60 bushels, was a quarter full after one pass. Clean, dry beans, bright tan in the early light, hardly a split bean among them. More importantly, the tractor hadn't sunk. The wheels had left tracks, yes, 2-inch deep tracks where the rear lugs had bitten in, but the machine had moved. It had floated across that crusted, treacherous soil the way a snowshoe floats across a drift. By 8:15, the fog had lifted enough that you could see the whole field. Dale Marsh later said that moment, seeing the whole field open up in the morning light with his father and that old machine moving through it, was the moment he understood something about farming that school had never taught him. That there is a knowledge that lives in the body, passed from hand to hand across generations, that no sales brochure and no new equipment can fully replace. More trucks had arrived. By 9 a.m., there were 14 vehicles parked along County Road 463. One of them was a cream-colored 1982 Buick LeSabre. Nobody called Gerald Pruitt. He came on his own, and nobody ever knew for certain why. Whether he'd heard something, whether he'd driven out to check on the property for the bank, whether something in him, some remnant of the rural Iowa upbringing he'd largely left behind, had made him want to see. He parked at the far end of the row of trucks and stood beside his car in his tan slacks and his bolo tie. He did not speak to anyone. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched someone prove the world wrong, quietly, without a single word? That's exactly what was happening on County Road 463. Let's keep going. By noon, Eldon had made 11 full passes through Lot 7. The grain wagon, an old Ellis Chalmers pull type he'd borrowed from Vernon Ackley the night before, was loaded to the rails twice over. Dale had made 2 runs to the elevator on East Arrow Street with the first load. 247 bushels, clean, 13.8% moisture, docked nothing. The ticket came back at $5.85 per bushel. 21 people watched the second tank auger out into the wagon. Nobody spoke very much. Not because they were unimpressed, quite the opposite. Small communities go quiet when they witness something that realigns their understanding of what's possible. It's a particular silence, not the silence of boredom or discomfort, but the silence of recalibration. The all-crop 60 chattered and thumped through the rows. The Farmall M idled along in second gear, steady and unhurried. Eldon Marsh sat on the tractor seat in his canvas jacket with his pioneer cap curved down over his eyes, and he looked at what was ahead of him in the field, not at the people watching from the fence. Ruth Marsh stood at the fence line in her church coat. She had brought a thermos of coffee, which she shared with Vernon Ackley's wife Carol, who had arrived around 9:30. They didn't talk much either. They'd been married to these men for a long time. They had seen this kind of thing before, the moment when something a man had worked on in private finally shows itself to the world. It always felt like watching someone open a gift that had been wrapped for years. Gerald Pruitt stood by his LeSabre for about 45 minutes. At roughly 12:30, he got in his car and drove back toward Marshall. He didn't say anything to anyone before he left. Vernon Ackley watched him go and later said, "He didn't look angry, he didn't look surprised, exactly. He looked like a man who'd made a calculation somewhere and found out the answer was different than he thought." When Eldon finished the last pass of Lot 7, about 4:30 in the afternoon, the sun dropping and the light going gold over the cottonwoods, he drove the Farmall back to the field edge, put her in neutral, and shut the engine. The crowd had thinned some, but a dozen people were still there, including Dale, Vernon, and Ruth. Dale walked out to meet his father when Eldon climbed down off the tractor. Eldon's knees were stiff from a full day on the seat. He was 61 years old and he'd worked every one of those years. He steadied himself on the tractor's front tire for a moment. "Final count?" he asked Dale. "2 more loads to go," Dale said. "We're looking at," he checked the notepad, "best guess, around 1,580 bushels out of Lot 7. Eldon nodded, did the math. Roughly $9,243 at the morning's price, assuming the moisture held, enough for 3 months of interest payments. Not enough to save the farm by itself, but enough, with his Lot 4 and Lot 6 corn still to settle on insurance and the winter wheat he was planning to plant, to keep the conversation going with the bank on different terms. He looked out at the field. It was clean. The rows of cut stubble caught the last light. "Your grandfather harvested this field in 1938, Eldon said. He wasn't talking to Dale exactly. He was talking in that way people talk when they're addressing something larger than the conversation. Droughted out, couldn't pay the note, harvested it with horses and the same machine and kept the farm. I always wondered if I'd have to do the same thing." Dale waited. "Turns out," Eldon said, "I did. Let me tell you what happened after." The harvest ticket from Lot 7, dated September 23rd and 24th, 1983, from the Saline County Farmers Cooperative Elevator, totaling 1,612 bushels of soybeans at $5.85 per bushel, came to $9,430.20. Combined with the insurance settlement on the damaged corn from Lots 4 and 6 and the sale of his winter wheat in June of 1984, which yielded better than expected after good spring rains, Eldon Marsh made his October payment to First Savings Bank of Marshall. He made the November payment. He made every payment through 1984. In the spring of 1985, land values in Saline County began a slow, fitful recovery. The interest rate environment softened. The farm crisis, though it continued to claim victims, over 200,000 American farms were lost between 1980 and 1988, began to turn in certain pockets of the Midwest for farmers who had held on long enough. Eldon held on. He didn't expand, he didn't take on new debt. He replanted his fields the following spring with the same disciplined, conservative approach his father had taught him, rotating his soybeans with winter wheat and keeping a small corner of Lot 3 in alfalfa for his half-dozen beef cattle. He kept his costs lean. He repaired instead of replaced. He bought nothing on credit that he could buy with cash. By 1987, the 240-acre Marsh farm was not prosperous exactly, but stable. It was fully current on its note. The note had even been restructured downward in 1986, when interest rates fell enough for Eldon to refinance at 11.5%, down from the 18.2% he'd been carrying. The difference in monthly payment was $680, which Eldon immediately began applying to principal. He paid the farm off in November of 1991. Dale was there at the closing. Ruth was there. They didn't have a party. Eldon drove home, sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and read the Saline County Farmer for 10 minutes like he did every morning. Then he went out and fed the cattle. The Allis-Chalmers All-Crop 60 went back under its tarp in the machine shed after the 1983 harvest. It hasn't run since Eldon retired from active farming in 1994 when he was 72 and turned the ground over to Dale on a long-term lease. But the machine is still there. Dale kept it. He's had 2 offers on it from collectors, one as recently as 2018, and turned them both down. "It's not for sale," he told the second man. "It's why we still have this farm." Now about Gerald Pruitt. Gerald Pruitt remained at First Savings Bank of Marshall until 1989, when the bank itself was acquired by a regional holding company and a number of positions, including his, were eliminated. He sold his interest in the farmland partnership that same year, reportedly at a modest profit. He moved to Springfield, where he worked in commercial real estate into the mid-1990s. There is no evidence that he and Eldon Marsh ever spoke again after that September afternoon in the co-op parking lot. But here is what matters more than Gerald Pruitt's story. At Hartley's Feed and Supply on East Vest Street in the weeks after the Lot 7 harvest, a different kind of conversation began. Farmers who had watched that Friday and farmers who'd heard the story second and third hand started asking each other a question. What do you have in your shed? What old machine, what inherited implement, what piece of your grandfather's approach to this land had you dismissed because it was slow or old-fashioned or not what the implement dealer was selling? 3 neighboring farmers asked Eldon if they could borrow the All-Crop 60 the following season. A 4th, whose own grandfather had owned an all-crop Model 40, drove 40 miles to his brother's farm to check whether it was still in the barn. It was. The 2 brothers spent a winter reconditioning it. None of this made the newspaper. None of it made any list. It was just the quiet, practical passing of knowledge from one generation's necessity to the next, the way it has always happened in agricultural communities when the conditions become extreme enough that old wisdom looks new again. Vernon Ackley told a reporter from the Marshall Democrat News in 1985 when they ran a small piece on local farm survival stories. Eldon didn't say anything that whole day. He just went back and forth across that field. But he said more with that tractor than most men say in a lifetime. Eldon Marsh died in March of 2003 at age 81 at his home on County Road 463. Ruth had predeceased him by 2 years. He is buried in the Salt Fork Cemetery, about 4 miles from the field where he spent the best and hardest years of his life. His obituary in the Saline County Farmer noted his Navy service, his church membership, his love of growing things. It did not mention the September of 1983 because the people who wrote it didn't think to. It was just something that had happened, part of the fabric of a life, not a headline. Dale Marsh still farms the ground. His daughter Rachel, Eldon's granddaughter, is learning. The Alley's Chalmers All-Crop 60, serial number AC 60487734, is under a blue tarp at the back of the machine shed on County Road 463. The tarp is weighted down at the edges with old disc blades to keep the wind from pulling it. It is waiting. Let me pause here at the end of this story and ask you something. We live in a world that rewards newness, that measures worth in horsepower, in screen size, in upgrade cycles, in how recently something was manufactured and how much it cost. We are surrounded by the implication that the new thing is the better thing, the smarter thing, that the man with the biggest combine and the freshest paint on his equipment is the man with the deepest knowledge of his land. Eldon Marsh knew better. But Eldon didn't know better because he was contrarian, or because he was old, or because he distrusted progress for its own sake. He knew better because he had paid attention. He had read his father's hand-drawn soil maps. He had kept a service manual from 1949 in a wooden box under his workbench. He had looked at a field full of good soybeans and a barn full of heavy, expensive equipment and asked a question that almost nobody else thought to ask. What do I know about this ground that the machine doesn't? That is not nostalgia, that is wisdom. There is a difference. Nostalgia looks backward because the present is painful. Wisdom looks backward because the past contains knowledge that the present has misplaced in its hurry. Eldon Marsh wasn't in love with the past. He was in love with his land, and he was willing to use whatever it took, old or new, to understand and serve it. He happened to know that in September of 1983, the right tool for his ground was a 2,800-pound harvester built in 1948, because the math said so. If a newer machine had done the job, he would have used it. The lesson is not, old things are better. The lesson is, know your ground. Know the thing you are tending, whether it is soil or a business or a family or a craft, deeply enough that you understand what it needs when conditions become extreme. Keep the knowledge your predecessors earned. Don't be so eager for the new and the bright and the approved by the dealer that you throw away the insight that cost someone else a lifetime to develop. Gerald Prout looked at Lot 7 and saw a number, a line item, and asked it to be written down and absorbed. He couldn't see what Eldon saw, not because he lacked intelligence, but because he'd never taken the time to learn the particular language of that ground. He didn't know the clay hardpan depth. He didn't know what the field looked like in September after a wet June. He never walked it in the dark before a planting day to feel the soil temperature through the soles of his boots. The person who knows the ground always has an edge on the person who only knows the price of the ground. And one more thing before we go. There is a peculiar grace in the moment when patience proves itself, not the loud, triumphant grace of a comeback speech or a dramatic confrontation. The quiet grace of a man and an old machine moving across a field at 2 miles per hour in the September fog, doing what needed to be done without announcement, without performance, without even the guarantee that it would work. Eldon Marsh didn't know for certain that the all-crop 60 would get through Lot 7. He had good reasons to believe it, but certainty is rarely available when you need it. What he had instead was preparation and knowledge and the willingness to act on both without waiting for someone to give him permission. That is enough. In my experience, that is always enough. The people who built this country, who broke this ground and kept it through drought and debt and every kind of ruin the weather and the markets could devise, they didn't wait for permission. They fixed what was broken in the shed before dawn. They showed up in the fog. They went back and forth across the field until the work was done. And then they went home and read the paper. Let me tell you, that is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything. The Marsh Farm on County Road 463 in Saline County, Missouri, still operates today. The Grand River still winds through the bottomland south of the field. In a wet September, the low ground still grows unstable in the particular way that Eldon's father first mapped in the 1940s. The soil remembers. The Allis-Chalmers all-crop harvester Model 60 was produced by Allis-Chalmers Manufacturing Company in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, from 1935 through the early 1950s. Thousands were made. Most are gone, scrapped, rusted, forgotten in barn collapses, or sold to dealers who parted them out for scrap. A small number survive in collections and in working condition, kept by the kind of people who understand that an object which saved a farm once might save one again. The Farmall M, produced by International Harvester from 1939 to 1954, was among the most produced farm tractors in American history. They were built to last. Many still run. Thank you for watching The Forgotten Farmer. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe, and the next time you pass an old shed with a tarp over something in the back, maybe wonder what's underneath. It might be exactly what someone needs. Historical context is real. Characters and dialogue are dramatized for storytelling purposes.